History does not echo, it whispers, and if you listen long enough, you may hear the footsteps of a boy born to storm the world. He wasn't forged in darkness or prophecy, but under the bright Aegean sun. His name would travel across continents like wind across wheat fields, not whispered, but thundered. Alexander. Yet before he was great, he was simply a child watching the fire in his father's eyes and the silence in his mother's smile. He learned early that empires are built not on love, but on legacy, ambition, and an almost divine hunger to be remembered. This is not a tale of war alone, nor merely of triumph. It is the story of a man too young to know fear and too brilliant to accept boundaries. A man who saw the edges of the map not as limits, but as invitations. He conquered more than land. He shattered borders of thought, stitched cultures together, and left behind a world forever changed, and yet still searching for who he truly was. Come closer. We're not reading from scrolls or counting battles. We're stepping into his world. One footfall at a time, through dust, through marble, through dreams. Let us begin. The first cries of the boy who would be king echoed across the stone walls of Pella, capital of Macedon, in the summer of 356 BCE. The air was dry. Cypress trees swayed like sentinels, and in the palace courtyard, a falcon broke free from its tether and soared into the sky. It was seen as a sign. His mother, Olympias, whispered to the gods as she held him, not as a mother holds a child, but as a priestess offers a vessel. She was wild-eyed, devout, and fiercely proud, descended from the royal house of Epirus and steeped in the mysticism of Dionysus. His father, Philip II, was a conqueror of flesh and land, one eye blinded in battle, the other fixed always on the next campaign. Alexander grew between them like fire between flint and steel. He was a boy of fierce appetites, not for food or rest, but for knowledge, for glory, for the ancient epics that pulsed like blood through the veins of Greece. He read of Achilles, not as legend, but as brother. He saw in the Iliad not a story, but a mirror. And so his world was not toys and lullabies, but lions, heroes, and stars. He would ride before he could walk with confidence. His first horse, Bucephalus, was a monster of a beast. Black as night and untamable. No one could break him. Until Alexander, barely a boy, noticed that the animal was afraid not of men, but of its own shadow. He turned the horse toward the sun, away from darkness, and mounted. Even then, he understood something most rulers forget. To master the world, one must first understand its fears. Philip watched his son from the portico and murmured to his generals, "Macedon is too small for him." But the road to empire is never built in childhood. It begins in fractures, and the first came quietly. At 7, Alexander was taken from his mother's chambers and placed into the harsh discipline of a noble's education. Spear drills, logic debates, sleepless watches, and cold river baths at dawn. He learned to endure, to command. And yet, he burned for something deeper. When he was 13, Philip summoned a philosopher, not just any, but the brightest mind in the known world, Aristotle. Aristotle didn't flatter. He didn't play court. He sat beneath the trees of Macedon and spoke of ethics, physics, and the golden mean. And Alexander listened, eyes fixed like a storm before it breaks. He asked questions that startled even the master. Why does the soul long for greatness? Is there a final edge to the world? Can a man live like a god, or does he merely die trying? It was here, under the trees, that Alexander's mind was sharpened. Not just for war, but for wonder. He came to believe that he wasn't merely human. Olympias fed him the tale that Zeus himself had fathered him in a dream. And the boy did not scoff. He began to see his bloodline not as a chain of kings, but as a ladder to Olympus. Still, Macedon was not a land of gentle dreams. It was sharp and tribal and old. Rebellions brewed like summer storms. Assassins whispered in alleyways, and Philip, for all his brilliance, was not a gentle father. He drank. He loved too many women. And one day he married again, a pure Macedonian, leaving Olympias cast aside. At the wedding feast, drunk on pride, Philip stumbled toward his son and called him illegitimate. Alexander stood, calm, still, and with the clarity of a blade said, "Shall I be king of half the world if I cannot sit at a table with my own father?" The court fell silent. Even the lyre players stopped mid-note. Philip raised his hand, then let it fall. Father and son drifted, but the boy did not slow. He began to gather allies of his own. Young nobles, loyal guards, even older generals drawn to the fire in his gaze. He studied Persian maps, trained in unconventional tactics, practiced Persian and Egyptian languages in secret. He was not merely preparing for succession. He was preparing for something far greater. Then, the knife in the dark. Philip was assassinated in the theater, just as he prepared to lead a campaign east. Some say Olympias orchestrated it. Others blame Persian gold. No one knows for certain. But one thing is clear. Within hours, Alexander had moved. He took the palace. He executed rivals. He secured the army. He placed his bodyguard as head of the royal council and claimed the throne before his father's blood had cooled on the marble steps. He was 20. And the world, though it did not know it yet, was about to be undone and rewritten. Not with ink, but with iron and fire. The throne of Macedon was not inherited. It was seized, quickly, decisively, without room for doubt. Alexander knew the cost of hesitation. At just 20, he stood before the assembly of nobles, not as a grieving son, but as a ruler already crowned by his own will. His voice didn't tremble. His gaze didn't flicker. He spoke with the terrifying serenity of someone who had seen destiny and had no intention of waiting for it to arrive. The nobles bent the knee. The army raised their spears. And yet, the soil of Macedon was restless. The old guard muttered that he was too young, that he was too proud, that without Philip's spine, the kingdom would collapse like a tent in the wind. Alexander heard them. He just didn't care. He began at home. Thrace rebelled. So he marched north, fast, brutal, unstoppable. Tribes who had never bowed to Philip were crushed beneath the hooves of Macedonian cavalry. Rivers ran red, fortresses smoked. And then, when winter should have slowed him, Alexander crossed the Danube under moonlight and fire. He did not wait for spring. He brought it with him. Back in Greece, rumors spread that he had died. Thebes, proud, ancient, defiant, rose in revolt. The Athenians whispered support. The Spartans watched with interest. Alexander turned south with the fury of a broken oath. When he reached Thebes, he gave no speeches, no ultimatums. He gave one night. When morning came, the city was no more. He ordered the walls pulled down, stone by stone. He spared only the temples and the house of Pindar, the poet, for even in wrath, he remembered beauty. The rest was silence. Word spread like wildfire blown across olive groves. The boy king was no boy. He was storm and steel. And with Thebes in ash, the rest of Greece bent low. But Alexander did not stay to bask. He had already outgrown his inheritance. In every room of the palace, there had always been one map, a faded outline of a kingdom that dwarfed all others. Persia. It had gold, cities, palaces, elephants, a king who called himself the King of Kings. Alexander looked east and saw not danger, but invitation. To most, Persia was impossible. To Alexander, it was destiny in disguise. He summoned his army. Not vast, just seasoned. 30,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, Macedonians and Greeks, veterans and dreamers. They crossed the Hellespont, that thin stretch of water where Europe kisses Asia, and set foot on Persian soil. He paused there. He didn't rush. He walked to the ancient site of Troy and laid a wreath at the tomb of Achilles, not out of duty, but kinship. Then he turned inland, toward battle. The first came at the river Granicus. Persian satraps waited on the far bank, confident, arrogant, underestimating. Alexander didn't hesitate. He led the charge himself, straight into the center where death was thickest. His helmet plume made him a beacon. Persian blades swarmed him. One sliced through his armor near the neck. Another shattered against his shield. He killed a nobleman with one thrust, then rallied his men with a shout that rang louder than the clash of metal. It was not just courage, it was performance. He wanted them to see him, bleeding, daring, divine. By nightfall, the Persians fled. Their general was dead. And Alexander's legend had begun to glow. But war was not a straight road. As they moved deeper, the landscape shifted. From coastal winds to sun-baked plains and broken mountains, Alexander moved like fire across oil. City after city submitted. Some welcomed him. Some resisted and were leveled. And still, he didn't slow. In the city of Gordium, where legend said an oracle once bound a knot that no man could untie, Alexander stood before it in silence. They say he studied it for a while, hands resting on the cord. And then without ceremony, he drew his sword and sliced it in half. Thus, he said, is the knot undone. It was a gesture, not of brute force, but of reinterpretation. He didn't solve the puzzle. He rewrote its rules. The message was clear. Tradition would not bind him. Myth would follow him. Further east, Darius III, the Persian king, could no longer ignore the storm swelling in his empire. He rallied a great host, hundreds of thousands, armies of many tongues and banners, chariots tipped with blades, baggage trains miles long. At Issus, they met. It was not a battlefield chosen by Darius. It was narrow, constrained, perfect for the tight Macedonian phalanx. Alexander saw it and smiled. He arranged his men with precision, like a sculptor placing the first cut in marble. Then he rode hard on the right flank, straight toward the enemy center, where Darius himself sat in a chariot flanked by immortals and guards. Chaos erupted. Screams, steel, dust. Alexander reached the heart of it. So close he saw the whites of Darius's eyes. And Darius fled. Not just retreated, fled. The King of Kings abandoned his army, his chariot, his family. By nightfall, the Persian line had crumbled. Alexander walked through the royal tent, silk still billowing, torches flickering, and sat in Darius's chair. He ate his food, touched his treasures. But when he found Darius's mother, wife, and daughters weeping, expecting death or worse, he knelt, he spoke softly, and he swore they would be treated with dignity. It wasn't weakness, it was theater. Mercy, when wielded by the conqueror, is the sharpest form of control, and from that day on, the Persians began to speak his name not with hatred, but with awe. But Alexander was not finished. He would chase Darius into the deserts. He would pass through cities carved into cliffs. He would begin to wear Persian robes. He would speak in Persian courts. And slowly, subtly, the boy who crossed the Hellespont in bronze armor began to look less like a conqueror and more like a king, not just of Macedon, but of something much older and far more dangerous: empire. The earth cracked under the hooves of thousands. Winds carried dust across broken hills, and far ahead, always just out of reach, moved the ghost of a king, Darius. Alexander chased him across Persia, not just to win, but to prove that the divine could bleed. He didn't need to kill Darius to rule, but he needed the world to watch him do it. Each day the sun rose hotter. Each night the horizon stayed distant. And yet Alexander did not turn back. His men ached. Their sandals wore to threads. Horses collapsed in sand. But he pressed forward, not because he doubted, but because he believed too much. In Egypt, where the Nile carved life into desert, he found a different kind of kingdom. The Persians had ruled it from afar. The priests had grown weary of foreign kings who neither spoke their tongue nor honored their gods. But Alexander arrived not as a stranger. He arrived as a son. He dressed in white linen. He bowed at the temples. He listened to the whispers of priests and let them crown him not just as Pharaoh, but as living God. Then on the edge of the delta, where the sea met the sky in a long blue sigh, he ordered a new city built. He walked the shoreline in silence. Then he turned and traced its shape in the sand with his spear. Its name would be Alexandria. To most, it was a name. To Alexander, it was a seed, a way to plant himself in eternity. He didn't just want to be remembered. He wanted to be everywhere. That same season, he rode through the western desert, an endless, unbroken emptiness, toward the oracle of Siwa, hidden deep in the sand. His generals protested. The route was deadly, the heat unbearable, the purpose unclear. But Alexander didn't explain. He wanted answers, not about war, but about himself. The desert tested them. Storms erased paths. Wells dried to cracked stone. Even the stars at night seemed too distant to follow. But still, they reached the oasis, Siwa, the breath of the gods. He entered the temple alone. What was spoken there, he never repeated. But when he emerged, his eyes were different. Calmer, colder, as though the world now confirmed what he had always suspected. He was more than king. He was chosen. After Siwa, something changed. He didn't speak of Macedon as home anymore. He spoke of unity, of blending east and west, of a world without walls. But unity, to a soldier, often sounds like surrender, and murmurs began to follow him, like crows behind a cart. Back in Persia, the chase for Darius continued, through mountain passes, across rivers that glittered with dying light, until at last, the Persian king was found, not in armor, but in betrayal. His own satrap, Bessus, had turned against him. Darius lay bleeding in the back of a fleeing cart, abandoned. Alexander arrived too late to strike the blow. He held the dying man in silence, then wrapped the body in royal cloth and sent it back to be buried with dignity. He had hunted Darius for years, not just to defeat him, but to become him. And now that path was closed. Alexander turned to the traitor instead. Bessus was hunted down, humiliated, and executed, not just for revenge, but to signal something deeper. Treachery would not be tolerated, even against his enemies. With Darius gone, Alexander took the Persian throne. He began to dress in royal robes, wore the diadem, adopted the etiquette of the Achaemenid court. He expected his generals to bow, to call him King of Asia. This did not sit well with the Macedonians. They had bled beside him, not beneath him. They drank with him, they joked with him, and now they were told to kneel. One night, wine flowing, tension broke into fire. A sharp exchange between Alexander and Clitus, an old friend, a veteran of Philip's wars, the man who had once saved his life. Words became venom. Clitus accused him of forgetting his roots. Alexander, drunk, wounded in pride, grabbed a spear and killed him. Silence fell like a curtain. He stood over the body for hours. The man who had walked into fire to become Achilles had now committed the one act Achilles never had. He had slain his own comrade, not in battle, but in rage. He wept, refused food, locked himself away. But the blood could not be unspilled. His men saw a fracture then, between the boy they had followed and the god he now claimed to be. And yet, they still followed. Why? Because even in doubt, he was mesmerizing. He dreamed wider than any man before him. He spoke of marrying east to west. He ordered his officers to take Persian wives. He took one himself, Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian noble. It was a political act, but also a romantic one. In her, He found not just beauty, but mystery. She challenged him, matched him in wit, danced in moonlight without fear. And for a moment, brief, flickering, the great conqueror looked like a man who might be happy, but happiness was never his destination. Soon, his eyes turned again to the horizon. Beyond Persia lay the last unknown, India, a place of legend and elephants, of kings with gold-plated chariots and armies trained in silence. It was not a land that welcomed strangers, but Alexander did not ask for welcome. He asked only that the map keep expanding. They crossed into India not like tourists of conquest, but as wanderers of the impossible. The air changed. The light thickened. The land pulsed with color, scent, and silence that felt older than the gods. Alexander had seen empires, but this was something else. India was not waiting to be taken. It had already decided what it was. Forests grew wild and dense. Rivers flowed thick and patient. The rain fell sideways and steady, drenching men in their sleep, in their armor, in their thoughts. Leeches clung to legs like black whispers. Insects droned like drums in the night. The air itself seemed to resist them, as if the land was warning them, "Go back." But Alexander had never listened to warnings. They pressed on, and soon they met opposition not in ambushes, but in full force. King Porus of the Paurava realm, tall, proud, said to ride elephants like horses, stood across the river Hydaspes with a force unlike any they had seen. Not vast, but prepared. The river itself was defiance, swollen by rains, deep and wide, impossible to cross in daylight. Porus watched them from the far bank, knowing they couldn't move without being seen. So Alexander waited. Then, one moonless night, he vanished into the dark with a portion of his cavalry. The storm had returned. Thunder stitched the sky with lightning. The river roared. But under the cover of chaos, Alexander crossed. Not once, not twice, but in repeated bursts, ferrying troops, carving footholds in mud. By dawn, he was behind Porus. The battle was a clash of elements. Macedonian phalanxes held their line as elephants charged, not symbols, but towers of bone and rage, trampling men like weeds. Alexander rode along the flank, weaving between infantry, his eyes locked on Porus. It was not enough to win. He had to see him. And then, through mist and rain, they met. Two kings, two worlds. One soaked in sweat, the other atop a beast with tusks that gleamed like scythes. They didn't speak. There was no time. Porus fought like a lion caught in a snare. He killed dozens, refused to fall, refused to retreat. But eventually, surrounded, wounded, exhausted, he was captured. Alexander approached. Porus stood tall, blood running down his arm, his crown broken, his face calm. Alexander asked, not as conqueror, but as a man who had just witnessed greatness, "How would you wish to be treated?" Porus replied, "As a king." And Alexander smiled, "You shall have it." He returned Porus his land and more. He wanted rulers, not slaves, legends, not servants. The soldiers murmured again. He gave back kingdoms, adopted foreign dress, walked with philosophers and spoke of Eastern wisdom. Who was he now? He pressed further, into deeper India, into lands where even the stars seemed unfamiliar. But something had shifted. The men no longer marched with the fire they once had. Their eyes, once fixed on the horizon, now looked west, home. At the river Hyphasis, Alexander called a meeting. The next great kingdom, the Nanda Empire, lay beyond. He laid out his plan. More conquest, more glory, a final strike to the edge of the world. But the response was silence. His men were tired, not just in body, in soul. They had bled for him. killed for him, crossed deserts, scaled mountains, fought ghosts and gods, and now, faced with the unending jungle and the memory of Macedon fading like a dream, they simply stopped. They would go no further. Alexander left the council without speaking. That night he walked the riverbanks alone. Rain whispered through the trees. Somewhere, a bird sang despite the storm. He had never been denied. Not by kings, not by cities, not by death itself. But here, before the curtain of India, he met a quieter enemy, the end of wanting. He returned the next morning calm and ordered a shrine built to mark the easternmost point of their journey. He said it was not surrender, just a pause, but everyone knew. The march had ended. They turned back, and it was not the same road. The jungles were cruel, the rains unrelenting. Disease took more men than arrows. The return route through the Gedrosian desert, a choice made by Alexander himself, became a death march. Sandstorms flayed skin from bone. Wells dried, camels collapsed. Thousands died, not in battle, but in thirst. And yet Alexander walked with them, refused water if none was left for all, carried the sick, wept over the dying. He was not a distant god then. He was a man, broken, blistered, sunburnt, and barefoot. They reached Persia again, not with cheers, but with silence. And when they arrived, they found the empire had begun to drift. Governors had grown fat with power. Old friends had turned ambitious. The machinery of conquest needed repair. Alexander worked like a man with fire beneath his skin. He issued decrees, rebuilt cities, punished corruption. And then, in the middle of it all, he held a wedding. Not for love, but for fusion. He married thousands of his men to Persian women in one grand ceremony. He married 2 daughters of Darius himself. To many, it felt like betrayal. But to Alexander, it was a blueprint. One world, one people, one future. But the seams were cracking. Old comrades whispered. The army still called him king, but with less reverence and more weariness. He had taken them far, but maybe too far. And somewhere deep in the marrow of the empire he had forged, something began to unravel. He dreamed of oceans, not the Aegean that had cradled his youth, but a greater one. The sea beyond the lands he had yet to touch. The Arabian coast, the edges of Africa, a circle to close the world. Alexander had not stopped dreaming, but his men had stopped believing. They reached Susa, one of Persia's royal capitals, not with cheers, but with haunted eyes. The wedding there, meant to unify East and West, only widened the rift. The Macedonians wore silk, kissed foreign brides, bowed to customs they did not understand. They drank, but did not toast. They marched, but did not sing. Alexander sensed it. The old fire, the fellowship built on blood and battles, had dimmed. To heal it, he tried humility. He dismissed thousands of Persian soldiers he had recruited, honoring them with lavish gifts. He reinstated old Macedonian veterans. He even begged forgiveness for the distance he had created between king and comrade. And still, something was missing. He turned to exploration. He sent ships south along the coast under the command of Nearchus, one of his most loyal captains. They would trace the unknown, link his empire by sea, find the edge of the world, or die trying. Alexander would march inland, through the heat, through hostile lands, forging roads, building harbors, drawing lines in sand with the confidence of a man who believed he still had forever. But time had grown quiet, and shadows began to gather. He returned to Persepolis, the city he had once burned in drunken vengeance, watching the fire rise like a funeral pyre for Persia's past. Now it lay ruined, cold, ashen. He walked the columns alone, his boots stirring cinders, his fingertips grazing carved lions and lotus flowers that no longer roared or bloomed. He had taken this city, but could not restore it. More troubling still, whispers began to follow him like smoke. Plots, conspiracies, poison. He uncovered a plan led by a trusted page. A child he had once taught to ride. The betrayal stung not because it was dangerous, but because it was so intimate. The boy was tortured, executed, and Alexander wept not for justice, but for the erosion of innocence. Babylon called, a city of gardens and towers, of markets humming with languages from all corners of the known world. A crossroads of ambition and memory. Alexander marched there with the weight of 2 continents on his shoulders. He did not arrive as a conqueror. He arrived as a ghost. In the quiet of his chambers, he spoke less of war, more of wonders. He planned a journey west to explore the sea that lapped the edge of Libya. He sketched cities he would one day build, ports he would one day name. He held banquets not for celebration but for connection, as though, in the laughter and the wine, he might revive the camaraderie of those early days in Macedon. But something had changed. He was thinner, pale, his voice quieter, his steps slower. At one feast, he excused himself early, something he had never done before. And the next morning, he did not rise. A fever had taken him. At first, no one panicked. He had survived wounds, storms, poisoned water, elephants. He had faced death more times than most could count. But this was different. Day after day, the fever grew worse. His breathing became shallow. He could no longer speak. His generals sat beside him, watching, not the fall of a man, but the unraveling of a world. Still, he did not scream. Still, he did not beg. He drifted in and out, eyes clouded, lips whispering names from long ago. He called for Hephaestion, his dearest friend, long dead. He called for his mother. He called for his horse, long buried beneath the eastern stars. The empire waited for instruction. His generals circled like wolves around a dying fire, each hoping for a final word, a named successor. But none came. On the 10th day, as the sun set behind the ziggurats, Alexander stirred once more. They leaned in close. He did not name a general. He did not name a son. He said only, "To the strongest." And then, quietly, he was gone. The body of Alexander the Great, once cloaked in gold, shadowed by armies, followed by stars, lay still. Just 32 years old. He had spent more than half his life at war. Outside the palace, the world did not know how to respond. There were no thunderclaps, no comets, only the sudden stillness that follows the end of something no one believed could end. Inside, his generals argued, who would lead? Where would he be buried? And most impossibly, what now? Alexander had united lands that had never known the same ruler, but he had left no map for peace, only ambition and memory, and the kind of silence that follows a name too large to say aloud. There was no thunder when he died, no storm, no prophecy fulfilled, only the quiet breath of Babylon and the uneasy stillness of men who had followed a living God, now returned to dust. Alexander's body lay untouched for days. They say no rot came, that his skin remained pale and smooth, his features peaceful, as if even death hesitated to disturb him. In truth, no one dared move him. The world was paralyzed, because the man who had carried it had let it fall. The question was simple. Who now? But the answer was war. His generals, once bound by loyalty and awe, turned inward. They gathered in tents and palaces, arguing not about mourning, but about inheritance. There was no heir, Roxana, heavy with child, was watched like a vessel. His half-brother Aridaeus, simple-minded, fragile, was crowned alongside the unborn child in a show of unity. But unity is not a crown. It is a mask. And the mask was already cracking. Ptolemy, wise, calculating, took the body, not the throne, the body. He believed whoever held Alexander's remains held his memory. And whoever held his memory might hold the empire. So he ordered the funeral procession west. The sarcophagus of Alexander was carved in gold, draped in imperial silks, guarded by soldiers who barely breathed. A rolling city of silence. But it never reached Macedon. Ptolemy intercepted the procession in Syria and redirected it to Egypt. There, in Alexandria, the city Alexander had named but never seen again, he built a tomb fit not for a man, but for myth. They say it shimmered with glass and white stone, that pilgrims wept before it, that Julius Caesar would one day weep there too. Back in Babylon, chaos bloomed like weeds. The empire had no center now, only hungry edges. The Diadochi, the successors, drew lines across the world Alexander had drawn as one. Seleucus took the east, Persia, Babylonia, the lands of Zoroaster and moonlit ziggurats. Lysimachus seized Thrace, where wild rivers met iron hills. Cassander took Macedon, Alexander's home, and with it, control of his mother Olympias. Ptolemy ruled Egypt with cunning, patience, and a scholar's gaze. They spoke of preserving the empire, but empires are not preserved. They are inherited or destroyed. Roxana, still grieving, gave birth to a son, Alexander IV. He would never rule. She and the child were kept under protection. And then, quietly, years later, they were murdered, suffocated by fear disguised as politics. With them, the bloodline ended. Macedon, the cradle of a dream, became a place of ghosts. Olympias, fierce and unyielding, tried to hold power through rage alone. She executed rivals, raised armies, cursed enemies by name. But even rage tires. Eventually, she too was captured and killed. The generals, now kings, began to fight not in Alexander's name, but in spite of it. Cities were razed. Old comrades slaughtered each other under banners that once rode together across the Indus. Statues were raised in every province, not of gods or ancestors, but of Alexander. Even in their betrayal, they could not forget him. And yet, the empire had changed. Greek became a global tongue. Persian courtiers wore Macedonian brooches. Cities called Alexandria multiplied like seeds scattered across the earth. In Egypt, in Syria, in Bactria, even as far as India. Everywhere coins bore his face, his sharp profile, that upward gaze, forever looking just past the horizon. He became a myth even while his bones still rested in glass and gold. Legends spread that he had not died, that he would return, that he walked the earth in another form. In the East, some called him Iskander, a prophet warrior touched by heaven. In the West, he became the template for empire, studied by emperors who feared him and longed to be him. Augustus, Napoleon, Caesar, they did not envy his life. They envied his reach. He had touched the limits of the known world, and though he had left it splintered, it still bore his fingerprints. But beneath the gold and the marble, beneath the myths and the maps, there was still a boy from Pella. A boy who had once tamed a horse by turning it toward the sun. A boy who had chased the edge of the world and found only his own reflection staring back. What did it all mean? The cities, the battles, the blood? Even his closest friends would wonder. Had they built something eternal? Or simply watched a storm pass, brilliant and brief? In the end, there was no one left who knew him completely. He had become something too large, too distant, too consumed by the very dream he had tried to live. And yet, even in ruin, even in division, the world had been reshaped, and his name had become not a memory, but a force. The world did not heal after Alexander. It adjusted. The men who followed him became kings. The lands he conquered became provinces. And the dream he carried was carved into cities, coins, and languages, but never again into one heart. There were now many Alexanders, one in each story, one in each ruin. To the Greeks, he was a champion of Hellenism, a torchbearer of their art, their gods, their reason. To the Persians, he was the destroyer of Persepolis, the foreigner who torched their palace and shattered their line of kings. To the Egyptians, he was a divine pharaoh, chosen by the oracle, entombed like a god. To the Indians, he was a flash of fire across their borders, terrifying, brilliant, and gone too soon to become more. And to historians, he is the question that cannot be answered. How much of him was vision, and how much was violence? His cities tell the first part of the story. Alexandria in Egypt rose from sand to legend. A lighthouse lit the sea like a second sun. The great library, centuries later, would gather all the knowledge of the known world beneath one roof, a dream that mirrored his desire to unite not just land, but thought. Elsewhere, in Syria, in Aria, in the lands now called Kandahar, Herat, and Bagram, other Alexandrias sprang up, outposts that bore his name like echoing footsteps across continents. Some thrived, some vanished, but all of them pointed to the same truth, that Alexander had tried to leave behind not just victory, but shape. He had wanted to bend the world into a form no one had yet imagined, a place where Persian satraps debated with Athenian scholars, where Zoroastrian fire temples stood beside Doric columns, where cultures did not clash, but fused. But empires cannot live on vision alone. The world he left behind was too complex, too stretched, and his generals, for all their strength, were not him. They could not hold the balance. The empire cracked along its cultural seams. Macedonians distrusted Persians. Persians resented Macedonians. Egyptians worshipped differently. Bactrians spoke in tongues few could translate. And so the dream, once bold and impossible, began to shrink. But even in retreat, it changed the course of history. Greek ideas, philosophy, geometry, astronomy spread deep into Asia. Eastern spices, silks, and texts traveled west in return. Trade routes that would later become the Silk Road began here, not as paths of empire, but as footprints of ambition. Alexander had not just conquered, he had connected. Still, connection does not always bring peace. The successor kingdoms, fractured, competitive, restless, warred for a century. In Macedon, in Egypt, in Seleucid lands, blood was the currency of power. And yet, each of these rulers claimed him. They commissioned statues, minted coins in his image, spoke his name at coronations. Even in their betrayal of unity, they needed his ghost to justify their crowns. He had become a myth that served all masters, a chameleon of memory. And yet, as the decades passed, something strange happened. Alexander began to appear not just in records, but in legends. In Persian folklore, he became Iskander Dul Karnain, the two-horned one, a just and noble king who journeyed to the edge of the world to build a wall against the forces of darkness. In Islamic tradition, he was folded into holy texts, transformed from conqueror into seeker. In the East, poems were written in his name. In the West, rulers styled themselves after him. And in every case, the real man, the sharp-eyed warrior from Pella, was blurred, refined, sanitized, canonized. Until what remained was not a human being, but a silhouette. Even his tomb, once a place of pilgrimage, eventually vanished. Its exact location is still unknown. Some say it was destroyed in riots. Others claim it was hidden by design, lost to protect his resting place from thieves or tyrants. A few believe he never truly died, that his bones were never placed in earth, that somewhere in some secret chamber beneath the dust of a forgotten Alexandria, the conqueror still sleeps. But if he does, the world he left behind no longer waits for him. The empires have changed, the borders redrawn. What remains are whispers, dust beneath marble, names in books, the gaze of statues whose eyes no longer see. And yet, there is something undeniable. When a child reads of distant lands, when a traveler stares at a foreign city and wonders who built it, when a soldier dreams not just of survival, but of legacy, there is something of Alexander in that fire. Because he did what few dare to try. He lived entirely in pursuit of the more, not just in land, but in possibility. He believed the edge of the world was not the end, but the beginning. Greatness has a pasta. It does not come in gold or glory. It comes in silence, in the absence of equals, in the slow erasure of those who once called you by your name, not your title. Alexander understood this, though perhaps not all at once. He had become the most powerful man on earth, but with each mile gained, something else slipped further from his grasp. There had been laughter once, fireside conversations with old friends who'd marched with him since boyhood, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Clitus, Hephaestion, men who had seen him at his rawest, who had dared challenge him, who remembered him before he was divine. But one by one, they changed. Or died. Some became governors, too busy to speak freely. Some became rivals, too wary to speak honestly. And some simply vanished. Hephaestion had been more than a friend. They had shared tents, campaigns, dreams. Where Alexander burned outward, Hephaestion calmed inward. They balanced each other at fire and stone. Some said they were brothers, others said more. But the truth was deeper than rumor. They trusted each other completely, and in the life of a king, that is a rare and holy thing. And then, he was gone. A fever. Sudden. Merciless. Hephaestion died in Ecbatana, far from home, in a land conquered but never truly understood. When Alexander heard, he collapsed. They say he refused food, tore his clothes, cut his hair, ordered the doctor crucified. He declared a mourning that lasted not weeks but months, built a funeral pyre as tall as a palace, commissioned temples in his name. The world called it excess. But grief, when worn by a god, becomes theater. And beneath that theater, Alexander was unraveling. After Hephaestion, he was never the same. He still led armies, still planned cities, still spoke of oceans and stars, but his voice was quieter, his eyes farther away. He began to surround himself with priests, astrologers, oracles, men who whispered of fate and fire and divine blood. He wasn't seeking praise, he was seeking meaning. Why this life? Why him? He had conquered everything and found no one left to understand what it had cost. Because when you stand atop the world, you are utterly, terrifyingly alone. He began to speak of gods not as stories, but as peers. He quoted Achilles, not with admiration, but as if remembering. At times, he would sit alone in his tent, surrounded by scrolls and stars, asking not what to conquer next, but what it had all meant. The men around him noticed. Some saw a prophet, others a madman. Many simply a tired king, too young to stop, too powerful to rest. He could have returned home. He could have built schools, libraries, gardens. He could have ruled from Macedon with the wisdom of an old warrior king, letting time sand away the edges of his myth. But he did not want peace. peace had never called to him. What he wanted was immortality, not the kind etched into marble, but the kind that rewrites the world. And so he pushed on, planning new expeditions, reorganizing provinces, inventing new ceremonies, writing letters to cities not yet built, all while his body, hardened by war but thinned by years of hunger, wounds, and fever, began to falter. His generals watched, some with worry, some with ambition, some with quiet, unspeakable relief, because they too were tired. They too had bled and burned and buried too many friends, and deep down, many knew if Alexander kept going, they would never stop. But stopping was not in him, even after the death of Hephaestion, even after his own sickness began to return in waves. He walked the palace halls at night, whispering maps to himself. He spoke of Arabian seas, Atlantic horizons, rivers that curved like serpents across Africa. And always, he wondered, would anyone remember what he had truly tried to do? Because conquest was never the point. Connection was, not just between cities, but between hearts. He had wanted to prove that the world could be one, that a man from Pella and a priest from Babylon and a scholar from India could see each other not as enemies, but as reflections. It was naive, it was magnificent, it was doomed, and he pursued it anyway. In that pursuit, he lost friends, he lost his mother, he lost home, and in the end, he lost himself, to fever, to time, to legend. But never to regret, because if he had not chased the impossible, no one would have ever known it could be touched. In the final months, Alexander didn't slow down. He accelerated. Even as his body weakened, his mind drew new frontiers. He drafted blueprints for new cities. He ordered a fleet of 1,000 ships to be built in Babylon, not for war, but for exploration. He summoned scholars to chart the tides of the Arabian Sea. He summoned engineers to connect rivers with canals, to stitch the land together like veins of one great living body. He spoke of sending embassies to the far Carthaginians. He studied the ancient stories of Gilgamesh and dreamed of meeting the gods beyond the world. And to his generals, weary, bruised, inward-turning, he gave instructions not just for battle, but for fusion. He wanted more intermarriage between peoples, more shared temples, a universal coinage, a single calendar. He wasn't trying to control the world anymore. He was trying to reshape it. But the world wasn't ready, and neither were the men beside him. Behind the palace walls, loyalty began to blur. Old Macedonian commanders resented the elevation of Persian courtiers. Eastern satraps whispered against Greek laws. And in the long shadows of Babylon's gardens, the empire's heart began to pull in different directions. Some say Alexander sensed it, that in those final days, when his voice weakened and his hands trembled, he knew what was coming. But he refused to name a successor. When asked who should inherit the world, he gave only 3 words: to the strongest. It was not guidance, it was a warning, and perhaps a challenge. Because how do you divide a dream? How do you measure the weight of vision? The empire he left behind had no central gravity. It spanned from the Nile to the Indus, but lacked the spine to hold itself upright without him. The moment he died, silence fell, and then almost immediately, it shattered. His generals, the Diadochi, split the empire like scavengers pulling at something still warm. Ptolemy claimed Egypt. Seleucus seized the eastern provinces, Persia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Lysimachus took Thrace. Cassander anchored in Macedon, and others circled, waiting for their moment. They called themselves kings. They raised their own standards, but all of them, every last one, kept Alexander's face on their coins. They dared not erase him. They needed his shadow to legitimize their crowns. And yet, they had already betrayed what he had tried to build. They didn't want to merge cultures. They wanted to rule them. They didn't see cities as bridges. They saw them as strongholds. And so, the map he had redrawn began to bleed at the edges. Revolts rose in India. Persian nobles conspired to reclaim old titles. Greek city-states stirred again with unrest. The old divisions, east and west, conqueror and conquered, returned. Alexander had tried to hold the world in his hands. But hands are mortal, and empires are heavier than dreams. Still, not all was lost. In the city of Alexandria, his name took root like a seed in the Nile soil. It flourished. Its lighthouse would one day guide sailors from 3 continents. Its library would become the brain of the ancient world. Its streets would echo in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, and languages the conqueror never lived to hear. Elsewhere, in Bactria and Sogdia, his legacy remained, not in monuments, but in blood. Communities of Greeks stayed, married, taught. Generations later, Greek kings still ruled in corners of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some of them bore names like Demetrius and Menander, shadows of a legacy still echoing through the hills. In every place Alexander passed through, he left more than ruins. He left possibility, a blueprint for something the world has always longed for yet never quite achieved. A civilization that does not divide, but multiplies. And though the wars that followed his death burned for decades, though his name was used by men who never understood his heart, though his vision was twisted, politicized, forgotten, one truth remained. He had made the earth feel smaller. Before Alexander, the known world was fractured, a series of closed circles. After Alexander, the circles touched. Ideas moved faster. Cultures touched. Roads stretched farther. Curiosity widened. And that, perhaps, was the true conquest. Not the battles, not the palaces, not even the cities, but the shift in what people believed was possible. He didn't just walk to the edge of the known, he moved it. He died young, just 32, an age when most men are only beginning to understand the shape of their lives, and he had already redrawn the shape of the world. Alexander left behind no blueprint, no crowned heir, no written philosophy, no sacred text, only motion, only memory, only the quiet ache of something unfinished. And yet, his name endured, long after Babylon crumbled, long after his generals died old and bitter, long after his empire dissolved into dust, Alexander remained. Not as a man, but as a question. What does it mean to live greatly? Is it to conquer? To be loved? To be feared? To be remembered? Or is it something quieter, something more human? Because the story of Alexander is not just one of ambition. It is also one of isolation, of a boy born in the shadow of greatness, raised by gods and poets, taught to believe that the world should bend. And when it didn't, he bent it. But even gods grow tired, and even empires need rest. In the end, Alexander stood among broken maps, lost friends, distant stars, and knew only that he had moved forward faster than the world could follow. And still, even knowing that, he never slowed. Because for him, there was no peace in stillness, only in becoming. He had walked beside philosophers, kings, priests, generals, and mystics. He had stared into the eyes of lions and storms and silence. He had seen the Himalayas rise like the bones of the earth. He had marched through deserts that could strip a man's soul from his skin. And through it all, he kept asking, what lies beyond? Even his enemies admired him. Even those who cursed his name would stop in the same breath and whisper that there had never been another like him. Because they saw what he saw. Not borders, but bridges. Not conquest, but connection. Not pride, but possibility. He was not flawless. He was not kind. He was not always just. But he was true to the vision that lived inside him like fire. And that is rare. History remembers kings, but it echoes with the footsteps of those who dreamed louder than the world allowed. Alexander was one of them. Perhaps the first, perhaps the last, but certainly the clearest. He turned away from comfort. He turned toward the unknown, and in doing so, he became more than a man. He became a thread, woven through centuries, tugged by poets, painted by emperors, studied by philosophers, envied by tyrants. He does not rest in a single place. He does not belong to a single people. He is carried by questions, by the ones who ask, can I go further? Can I see more? Can I shape what others say cannot be shaped? That is his legacy. Not the cities, not the statues, not even the wars, but the daring, the refusal to live a small life. And if you have ever dreamed too big, if you have ever stood at the edge of something and whispered, what if? Then a part of you already knows him. Alexander the Great. The dust has long settled. The swords are sheathed. The cities weathered. The names faded from marble. But still, his story lingers. Not because of the wars, not because of the empire, but because we are still trying to understand how one man in so short a life reached so far into time. Alexander did not leave behind peace. He left behind motion. He fractured the old world so that something new might grow in the cracks. And whether you see him as visionary, tyrant, hero, or ghost, you must still look at what he dared. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. And perhaps that is why we still whisper his name. Because within all of us, there is something that longs to leave a mark, to walk a little further, to dream a little louder, to touch the edge of the map, and keep going. Thank you for joining us on this journey, not just through history, but through imagination. If this story moved you, if it stirred something ancient or new within you, don't forget to like and subscribe. More stories are waiting. More voices, more echoes of lives that shape the world and still speak even now through the dust. Until next time, let the past remind you, there is still so much to explore. Sleep well, traveler, or rise inspired. Either way, carry the story.